Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Blue Values Journey podcast, which features Professor Rose Boswell, the South African Research Chair in Ocean Cultures and Heritage. I'm David, your host, and this episode is about territorial diversity. We'll jump straight into Rose's answer to my question about how her interest in the theme of territorial diversity arose in the first place.
What I have in mind is the notion or the idea of the extent to which these extraordinarily diverse landscapes influence cultural perception and cultural life. For instance, if I go back to the first part of the research that we did in late 2022, when we were discerning the form and the substance of what it was that we were going to do for the Blue Journey, we found ourselves in the northern part of Namibia. We were driving along this absolutely beautiful and ancient riverbed landscape called the Hwanib Valley and into an area known as Puros, where there are a number of Ovahimba peoples or Himba peoples. And of course, this is a northern part of Namibia. The sea is very far from these communities. And we learned, of course, in our general conversation with some of the Himba people that we met, that, of course, water is a scarce resource because of these dry lands which they occupy, and they rely to a large extent on seasonal rains. There is no use of water on a daily basis in this community. The people use ochre. They make a paste from ochre, which they basically cover their skin with, and it protects them from the sun. And it also provides a way of ensuring that the skin and the body remains clean and does not attract insects and so on and so forth. So from what we gathered, the community there is not necessarily using water for bathing purposes. They use the ochre, and they also have something called the holy fire. But the holy fire is more for medicinal purposes, but they use fire and smoke from fire to basically keep their bodies clean. So already we begin to see how the absence of water can shape daily life. An extension of this, of course, was the fact that not only were these Himba peoples using the smoke to keep the body clean, but as I alluded to very briefly earlier on, they have this idea of the holy fire. In the middle of the village community, there is a holy fire that is maintained by the chief. It is the responsibility of the chief to maintain this holy fire. And the holy fire is what helps to connect the local community with the ancestors, with the healing spirits. And so if there's a particular issue or an illness, then the afflicted candidate will position themselves close to this fire. The chief will be there and the particular question will be asked. And there's an entire ritual process which kind of ensures that fire is an integral part of the healing process. That's just one story.
So this experience that you had during your research in the north of Namibia, how does it give us a glimpse into what the concept of territorial diversity is all about?
So territorial diversity is a really valuable concept. I'm still grappling with it and unraveling it. But my sense is that in the pursuit of deeper understanding of cultural heritage in Africa, that we have focused extensively on what people are doing and the human valuations of nature, rather than kind of subverting that and looking at the natural context and understanding how nature is influencing cultural practice, cultural beliefs, and cultural values. And for us, it was really interesting because after this experience with the Ovahimba people in northern Namibia in 2022, the following year, we traveled eastward into Namibia, where we encountered sand descendants, people who refer to themselves as the High Kom peoples of Namibia. There, we also learned the importance of fire, of being able to also discern where water is, because the landscape in that particular area is also a fairly water scarce area. We also learned that it's not just the nature insofar as fire and access to water is concerned, but also that the moon plays an incredibly important role. So the elemental landscape, the stars and the moon, are also very important to the shaping of cultural practice. What this story has to do with the Blue Values Journey project is that, of course, we wanted to understand not only what is happening at the coast, but whether there is any kind of connection between inland peoples and coastal rituals. Are there any rituals that they enact? And as I shared in an earlier episode as well, was that we certainly found that even though communities were dislocated from the ocean, or basically that didn't have access to the ocean, that they did retain some historical memory of rituals that are done with the sea. And we try to help these community members to reenact those rituals, to reconnect with the ocean. So the point I'm getting to here is that there are two things at play. On the one hand, you have the enduring reality of the territory in which you are embedded. So if it's a water scarce area, you're going to be looking at elements that can be rendered more meaningful, that can be integrated into ritual practice. In the case of the Ovahimba, it's the fire. In the case of the Haikon people, we saw fire was also very important, but also the elements, the stars, the moon, and so on. On the other hand, you also have the impact of deterritorialization on continued access to other forms of territorial diversity. So the Haikon peoples, the San peoples, these were nomadic people, traveled vast distances, settling down in a particular area for a short period of time for hunting purposes, communing with other coastal groups that were also nomadic. But with the institution of colonial rule and apartheid, and also restrictions on the movement of people, very much like in South Africa, because people would have to carry a form of identification if they wanted to move into certain parts of the country. That level of mobility across these territories became quite limited and restricted. Ironically, and I think sadly as well, the secondary data, and by this I mean the literature that we also read to support our understanding of the Namibian cultural landscape. The literature also tells us that the stereotyped perception of the San peoples, the perception of them by the colonials as being close to nature, influenced their mobility within the Namibian landscape and across these territorial diversities that I'm talking about, because under the apartheid regime, quite a few San descendants, and we came across them in Tsumeb in the northeastern Namibia, quite a few of them were used or were employed as trackers by the South African National Defence Force. So they were used in from what we understand from the secondary literature, this is work by people such as Stuart Douglas, who's a contemporary of mine way back when I was a graduate student. His field work was in Namibia. John Sharp was Stuart's supervisor at the time. What they basically documented was the extent to which the San men in particular were used as trackers to assist in furthering the sort of guerrilla warfare that basically took place across the borders between Namibia and South Africa back in the day. In essence, there are many forms of territorial diversities that we're looking at. So it's the cultural aspect of the use of particular elements, fire, water, and so on, in order to constitute the cultural identity. Then there's deterritorialization, which is brought about by the impact of colonization on communities and the restriction of their movements. Then there is the re-territorialization of people through the use of indigenous peoples as trackers for political ends. So the story of territorial diversity is very interesting. And if you go beyond the indigenous and First Nations people of Namibia, you realize the extent to which the colonial process itself produced re-territorialization. So this is something that I'm still analyzing, but how farmlands became these nodes of sociality where the colonial communities could reach out to in a very harsh landscape. Namibia is described as the land of the brave, and not for any, uncomplicated reason. It really is a harsh landscape, and you need to have reserves of fortitude to basically survive in that landscape, especially back in the day when we didn't have modern telecommunications and access to cell phones and so on. Communication between these different areas was often extraordinarily difficult. Traversing this landscape is also one which requires an enormous amount of confidence and persistence, because some of the areas are very, very difficult to traverse. So if you are driving, for example, I talked about the Hwaneb Valley in the northern part of Namibia, as you're going up that skeleton coast. If you travel along the Hwaneb Valley, which is a riverbed, and then you drive again through to Palmwag and then onto to Sesfontein, some of those roads are commonly described as tire eaters, and for very good reason. I mean, and we experienced it, certainly. And it's become an integral part of understanding the logistics of the Blue Values journey, because you have to know where to go and how to manage it. I mean, in our first field work that we did in Namibia, in the space of, I think, 100 kilometers, we had 4 tire punctures. And all because we didn't understand that you have to navigate between the different topographies. So when you're on sand, your tires have to be at a certain pressure. When you're on the hard gravel surface, you have to have higher pressure in those tires. Otherwise, you're going to shred those tires. And we didn't realize that until we had shredded 4 tires. So the Blue Values journey is also about the logical and practical understanding of that landscape, and not just for ethnographic purposes too.
You've spoken about people in Namibia who I would say obviously live closer to nature than most people in our modern, advanced, industrial, technological society. What has your research shown you about our own lives, the average person's life in a city, for example? Because you could say that there's not a whole lot of diversity in a city. I suppose you could say that about the desert as well until you look closer. I feel like the city's a bit more of a monoculture or a bit more homogenous. Is there any insight you've drawn from your research work in Namibia, insight that you can share about our own lives in technological, advanced industrial cities?
I think if I can start with Namibia, and I can look at what is really very specific to the coast of Namibia and to a certain extent the capital city, urban context of Windhoek, I found it absolutely incredible how the landscape is still so symbolically marked by its cultural history of colonialism. The markers are very much there. It's in road signs, it's in the food that is consumed, it is around particular traditions, it's in the beer and the cider. So you have a full immersive cultural experience when you're in Namibia that makes it very clear that you are in this particular historically influenced territory. And this is in the case at the coast as well. So in Swakopmund, which is another site of our Blue Values journeys that we undertake, there is an incredible German cafe on the coast. We interviewed the owners of that cafe and we ate the food from the cafe. And the food basically reminds you of a bakery in Germany. So they have their cheesecake that they make is specific to what is done in, their hometown in Germany. The donuts that they have are also important in that regard. So talking about the urban context, what you see, it's in the food heritage, which is the work of our postdoctoral fellow, Dr. Jessica Thornton. It's in the food heritage of the country that shapes the cultural experience, that also territorializes a particular country. So Swakopmund then becomes this place of German cultural expression because of the cafe, because of the German food that is presented there and the replication of that in other chain restaurants. Your equivalent of the Eisbein, for example, the pork roast, and the schnitzel, which is ubiquitous across the whole of Namibia, and all the baked goods. And then along with that, what is also interesting is the landscape, of course, is something that contains indigenous animals. Your springbok, your oryx, these are animals that are unique to the Namibian landscape or to the desert landscape, and they are also part of this food heritage. It is the taste sensations which essentially help to produce a social and cultural experience of that particular landscape. And what is fascinating, I think, if we think of a town or a city outside of Namibia, Cape Town, Johannesburg, New York, these are multicultural global cities, but there are specific globalizations that actually influence the cultural experience that you're going to have in those cities. Some of that globalization is historicized. So in a place like Cape Town, for example, your East Asian Malay history has an impact on the kind of food and the kind of music, even the architectural heritage that you're going to experience in that particular city. And the same can be said for Johannesburg, and the same can be said for New York. Of course, these cities are not comparable. There may be some comparisons that one can make, but there are so many social, economic, and political factors basically influencing the form and the substance of cultural heritage and the territorialization of those spaces. I think of Johannesburg, for example. I think of one image that, springs to mind, maybe not a wonderful image, maybe of the Golden City, but the degradation of the inner city of Johannesburg and the storying, the narration of that space by South Africans as a space that is increasingly inhabited by people who are not legally in South Africa. So there are always these layers of stories. And I also saw it in Namibia as well. I saw it in Arandis, which is on the border of the Dorob National Park. And in Arandis, we came across Malawian migrants who had difficulty entering South Africa because of the border rules and so on, that had crossed the Southern African landscape to arrive in Namibia and to work on the mines in and around Arandis. So territorial diversity is a very interesting thing and a very complex phenomenon. I could add on to that in many different ways. Of course, it's the shaping of that landscape by the farmlands that I spoke to you about. One could add tourism as yet another layer, the arrival of people on a seasonal basis in a particular area that shapes the landscape, whether they're putting down tents in the middle of the desert and creating a unique under the stars kind of experience of the Namib sand, or whether they are traveling along that landscape and eating in restaurants in order to experience the German historical culture. But essentially, we see territorialization in a diversity of ways. It's in your national parks, it's in the cultural factors. And to understand cultural heritage in Namibia and to implement the Blue Values Journey project, we've had to take into account all these diversities, which are quite dynamic as well.